The crystal chandelier that had once sparkled above 17-year-old Alessandra Thornfield's head during countless family dinners now cast shadows over her as she scrubbed the marble floors beneath it, her knees raw and bleeding through the thin fabric of her servant's dress. 6 months ago, she had been the beloved heir to the Thornfield banking empire, worth $300 million. Tonight, she was invisible, just another nameless girl in a gray uniform, cleaning the very mansion where she had once been princess. The cruel irony was that none of the other servants, not even the head housekeeper Mrs. Caldwell, knew they were ordering around the rightful owner of everything they saw. But Alessandra knew, and that knowledge burned in her chest like swallowed fire as she watched her uncle Maximilian Thornfield hold court in what had been her father's study, entertaining business associates with expensive whiskey while wearing her father's platinum watch. The transformation from riches to rags had happened so swiftly that sometimes Alessandra wondered if her previous life had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. Just 7 months earlier, she had been preparing for her 18th birthday celebration, a grand affair that would have cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Her parents, Nathaniel and Isabella Thornfield, had spared no expense in planning what they called her debut into society, complete with a custom Valentino gown, a string quartet flown in from Vienna, and guest lists that read like a who's who of international high society. Alessandra remembered standing in her walk-in closet, which was larger than most people's bedrooms, trying to choose between diamond earrings that had belonged to her great-grandmother and sapphire studs that matched her eyes, completely unaware that in less than 2 weeks, she would own nothing but the clothes on her back. The plane crash that killed her parents had been sudden and devastating, but not suspicious, a private jet caught in an unexpected storm over the Atlantic while returning from a business trip to London. Nathaniel and Isabella Thornfield died instantly, along with their pilot and 2 business associates, leaving behind a grief-stricken daughter and an empire worth hundreds of millions. What Alessandra didn't know, as she wept at their funeral surrounded by hundreds of mourners, was that her uncle Maximilian had been planning this moment for years. He had always resented his older brother's success, always believed that the family fortune should have been split equally between them instead of going entirely to the firstborn son according to tradition. Maximilian Thornfield was a master manipulator who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing devoted while secretly plotting betrayal. At the funeral, he held Alessandra close as she sobbed into his expensive suit, whispering words of comfort while his mind calculated how quickly he could gain control of her inheritance. "Don't worry, my dear," he murmured, his voice thick with false emotion. "Uncle Max will take care of everything. Your parents would want you to focus on healing, not on boring financial matters." Alessandra, devastated by grief and overwhelmed by the complexity of suddenly inheriting a business empire, gratefully accepted his offer to handle the estate's affairs temporarily. What she didn't realize was that Maximilian had been forging documents for months, preparing for the opportunity that her parents' death would provide. Using his position as Nathaniel's brother and business partner, he had created false debts, fake loan documents, and fraudulent contracts that made it appear as though the Thornfield fortune was actually deeply in debt. He had bribed accountants, lawyers, and bank officials to support his fabricated financial crisis. By the time Alessandra was emotionally stable enough to ask questions about her inheritance, Maximilian had already convinced the courts that the estate was bankrupt and that he, as the closest male relative, should be appointed as executor to handle the financial disaster that Nathaniel had supposedly left behind. "I'm afraid I have terrible news, Alessandra," Maximilian had told her 6 months after the funeral, his face a masterpiece of fake concern. "Your father, God rest his soul, was not the businessman we thought he was. He made some very poor investments, took out massive loans he couldn't repay, and frankly, was living far beyond his means. The estate is not just broke, it's deeply in debt. We're going to lose everything, the mansion, the cars, the jewelry, even the family business." Alessandra had stared at him in shock, unable to process what he was saying. Her father had been brilliant, cautious, successful for decades. How could everything be gone? The answer, of course, was that everything wasn't gone, it had simply been transferred to Maximilian through a carefully orchestrated fraud that would have made professional criminals envious. But Alessandra, sheltered and naive despite her intelligence, had no reason to suspect that her beloved uncle was capable of such elaborate deception. She had grown up calling him Uncle Max, had spent countless Christmas mornings opening presents he had given her, had trusted him completely when he promised to take care of her after her parents died. The final blow came when Maximilian informed her that she would need to leave the family mansion immediately. "The bank is foreclosing next week," he explained with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "I've managed to secure a small apartment for you across town, and I'll provide a modest allowance until you finish school and can support yourself. I know this isn't what your parents would have wanted, but sometimes life forces us into situations beyond our control." What he didn't mention was that the small apartment was actually a single room in a boarding house in the worst part of the city, and the modest allowance would barely cover food, let alone clothing or school expenses. As Alessandra packed her belongings into 2 suitcases, all that would fit in her new living space, she felt as though she was watching someone else's life unfold. 6 months ago, she had owned more shoes than she could count, jewelry worth more than most people's houses, and artwork that belonged in museums. Now she was carefully choosing which few items meant enough to her to keep, while everything else would be sold to pay debts that didn't actually exist. The boarding house where Maximilian had arranged for her to live was a nightmare of broken dreams and desperate people. Alessandra's room was barely large enough for a single bed and a small dresser, with walls so thin she could hear her neighbors arguing, crying, or worse. The shared bathroom at the end of the hall was filthy and often occupied, forcing her to wait for hours sometimes just to wash her face. The other residents were a mixture of addicts, ex-convicts, and people who had simply run out of options, none of whom had any patience for a former rich girl who was clearly out of her element. But the worst part wasn't the living conditions or even the constant fear for her safety. The worst part was the isolation. Alessandra's former friends, the children of other wealthy families, had disappeared from her life as quickly as her fortune. Phone calls went unreturned, invitations stopped coming, and the few times she encountered former classmates on the street, they either didn't recognize her or pretended not to see her. She learned the brutal truth that most of what she had believed were friendships had actually been alliances of convenience, relationships built on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. School became impossible to continue. Without money for tuition, books, or even basic supplies, Alessandra was forced to drop out of the prestigious private academy where she had been preparing for admission to Harvard. Her dreams of studying international business and eventually taking over her family's empire crumbled along with everything else. Instead, she found herself walking the streets looking for work, any work that would pay enough to keep her from starving. But finding employment proved nearly impossible for a 17-year-old girl with no work experience, no practical skills, and an education that had focused on languages, literature, and classical music rather than anything useful in the real world. Restaurant managers took one look at her soft hands and obvious unfamiliarity with physical labor and dismissed her immediately. Retail stores wanted references she didn't have and experience she couldn't claim. Even fast food chains seemed to sense that she didn't belong in their world. After weeks of rejection and dwindling resources, Alessandra was facing the very real possibility of homelessness when she saw a newspaper advertisement that changed everything: domestic staff needed for prestigious Beacon Hill mansion. Live-in positions available. No experience necessary for the right candidates. Apply in person at the Thornfield estate. The irony was so bitter it nearly choked her. Her own family's mansion, now under Maximilian's control, was hiring servants. The home where she had been raised as a princess was looking for maids, and she was desperate enough to apply. For a moment, she considered whether this might be some kind of trap, whether Maximilian somehow knew about her circumstances and was toying with her. But then she realized the truth was far simpler and more insulting: her uncle had no idea where she was or how she was living, because he didn't care enough to check. To him, she had served her purpose by signing away her inheritance, and now she was simply irrelevant. The decision to apply for a servant position in her own home was one of the most humbling moments of Alessandra's life, but desperation made the choice for her. She walked up to the front door of the mansion where she had once lived like royalty, now wearing a cheap dress from a thrift store and carrying a fake resume she had created claiming previous domestic experience at homes in Europe, places where no one could easily verify her claims. Mrs. Caldwell, the head housekeeper who had been hired after Alessandra moved out, was a stern woman in her 50s who ran the household staff with military precision. She had worked for wealthy families for decades and prided herself on being able to spot potential troublemakers from a mile away. When she interviewed the young woman calling herself Anna Fielding, Alessandra had chosen a false name to avoid any chance of recognition. She saw a pretty but obviously desperate girl who seemed educated but down on her luck. "Have you ever worked in service before, Miss Fielding?" Mrs. Caldwell asked, studying Alessandra's face carefully. "Yes, ma'am," Alessandra replied, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the shame burning in her cheeks. "I worked for several families in England before coming to America. I'm experienced in all aspects of household management, from cleaning to serving formal dinners." It was a complete lie, but Alessandra had grown up observing the servants in her own home, and she was intelligent enough to understand the basics of what would be expected. More importantly, she was desperate enough to learn quickly and work harder than anyone else to prove herself worthy of the position. Mrs. Caldwell hired her on a trial basis, offering room and board plus a small weekly salary in exchange for general housekeeping duties. Alessandra's room would be in the servants' quarters, a small, plain space in what had once been the mansion's third-floor storage area. The irony of sleeping in a servant's room 3 floors above her former bedroom was not lost on her, but she accepted the position gratefully and promised to start the following Monday. Her first day as a servant in her own home was surreal beyond description. Alessandra found herself dusting furniture she had grown up around, polishing silverware she had eaten with for 17 years, and scrubbing bathrooms she had once used without ever thinking about who cleaned them. Every corner of the mansion held memories of her previous life, from the library where her father had read to her as a child to the music room where her mother had taught her to play piano. But the most difficult part was encountering Maximilian himself. On her third day of work, she was cleaning the main staircase when he came home from a business meeting, talking loudly on his phone about a deal that would make him another 10 million by Christmas. He walked right past her without a glance, treating her exactly like what she appeared to be, an invisible servant whose job was to maintain his comfort while remaining unnoticed. The man who had destroyed her life and stolen her inheritance literally stepped over her as she knelt scrubbing the stairs, and he had no idea that the girl at his feet was his own niece. "Anna, make sure the crystal in the dining room is spotless," Mrs. Caldwell instructed her later that afternoon. "Mr. Thornfield is hosting an important dinner party tonight, and everything must be perfect." Alessandra nodded and went to work on the chandelier she had grown up beneath, polishing each crystal while listening to Maximilian on the phone in the next room, discussing his plans to expand the business using recently acquired capital. That night, as she served dinner to Maximilian and his guests, wealthy business associates who had once attended parties at her own family's table, Alessandra felt as though she was living in an alternate reality. She moved silently around the dining room, refilling wine glasses and serving courses, while the men discussed deals and acquisitions as if she didn't exist. At one point, Maximilian raised his glass in a toast, to my late brother Nathaniel, who would be proud to see the family business thriving despite the challenges we've faced. The hypocrisy was so breathtaking that Alessandra nearly dropped the serving tray she was holding. But as weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to happen. Working as a servant, invisible and ignored, gave Alessandra a unique perspective on Maximilian's operation that she never could have gained as his niece. She overheard phone conversations about business deals, witnessed meetings with lawyers and accountants, and slowly began to piece together the scope of his deception. She realized that not only had he stolen her inheritance, but he was using the Thornfield name and reputation to commit fraud on a massive scale. Living in the servants' quarters also introduced her to people she never would have met during her privileged upbringing. The other household staff, Maria, a young immigrant woman from El Salvador who sent most of her earnings home to her family, James, an older black man who had worked in service for 30 years while putting his daughter through medical school, and Sophie, a college student working nights to pay for her education, became the first real friends Alessandra had ever had. They accepted Anna Fielding, without question, judging her only on her work ethic and character rather than her bank account or family name. "You're different from most rich girls who try to work in service," Sophie observed one evening as they shared a simple dinner in the servants' kitchen. "Usually they think they're too good for the work, or they're just playing at being poor until daddy's money comes through. But you actually care about doing things right." Alessandra smiled sadly, wishing she could tell Sophie the truth about why she cared so much about proving herself. "I guess I learned early that nothing in life is guaranteed," she replied. "You have to work for everything that matters." It was Maria who inadvertently gave Alessandra the key to understanding just how extensive Maximilian's fraud had been. While cleaning his office one morning, Maria had accidentally knocked over a stack of documents, and Alessandra had helped her gather them up. Among the papers was a bank statement showing transfers of millions of dollars to offshore accounts, along with what appeared to be forged signatures on loan documents bearing her father's name. That night, unable to sleep, Alessandra began to research everything she could about financial fraud, forensic accounting, and inheritance law. Using the mansion's computer late at night when everyone else was asleep, she started building a case against her uncle, documenting every piece of evidence she could find. She photographed documents with her phone, recorded conversations when possible, and began to understand the full scope of what had been stolen from her. The process was slow and dangerous. Alessandra had to be careful not to arouse suspicion while gathering evidence, which meant maintaining her role as a servant while secretly investigating the man who employed her. She also had to overcome her own lack of legal and financial knowledge, teaching herself through online courses and legal websites how to understand the complex fraud that had been perpetrated against her family's estate. But the most challenging aspect was emotional. Every day, Alessandra watched Maximilian enjoy the fruits of his theft while she struggled to survive on a servant's wages. She saw him wearing her father's jewelry, sitting in her father's chair, making decisions about her father's business as if it had always belonged to him. The rage and grief were almost unbearable at times, but she channeled those emotions into determination, using her anger as fuel for her investigation. The breakthrough came 6 months after she had started working as a servant, when she overheard a phone conversation between Maximilian and his lawyer that revealed the location of offshore accounts where much of the stolen money was hidden. Armed with this information, Alessandra finally felt ready to take action. But she also knew that going to the authorities as a servant named Anna Fielding would carry far less weight than revealing her true identity and presenting evidence as the rightful heir to the Thornfield fortune. The decision to reveal herself was terrifying but necessary. Alessandra chose to do it during one of Maximilian's dinner parties, when he would be surrounded by witnesses and unable to simply make her disappear or dismiss her claims. She spent days planning exactly what she would say and do, knowing she would only get one chance to expose the truth before Maximilian found a way to silence her. On the night she chose for her revelation, Alessandra served dinner as usual, moving silently around the table while Maximilian entertained his guests with stories about his business successes and charitable donations. When the main course was finished and she was serving dessert, she set down her serving tray and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the dining room. "Uncle Max, don't you think it's time you told your guests how you really acquired the Thornfield fortune?" The silence that followed was deafening. Maximilian looked up at her with confusion, clearly not recognizing the voice or understanding why a servant was speaking out of turn. His guests looked equally puzzled, some annoyed by the interruption and others curious about what was happening. "I'm sorry," Alessandra continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I should have introduced myself properly when I started working here. My name is not Anna Fielding, it's Alessandra Thornfield, and this is my house." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Maximilian went completely white, his wine glass falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers to shatter on the floor. His guests looked back and forth between him and the young woman in a servant's uniform who claimed to be his supposedly penniless niece. Mrs. Caldwell gasped from the doorway, finally understanding why Anna Fielding had seemed so familiar with the mansion's layout. "That's impossible," Maximilian stammered, rising from his chair. "Alessandra is, she's living across town. She has no money, no claim to this house. This girl is clearly delusional, probably hoping for some kind of reward or attention." But Alessandra was prepared for his denials. From her apron pocket, she pulled out a photograph of herself with her parents at her 16th birthday party, taken in this very dining room less than 2 years earlier. She also produced copies of the bank statements and forged documents she had photographed, along with recordings of conversations she had captured over the past 6 months. "These documents show exactly how you transferred my family's assets to accounts under your control," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "The signatures on these loan documents are forgeries. I've had them analyzed by a handwriting expert. And these recordings prove that you knew exactly what you were doing when you claimed my father's estate was bankrupt." As the evidence mounted, Maximilian's guests began to back away from him, realizing they were witnessing something far more serious than a servant's delusion. Some of them had known Nathaniel Thornfield personally and could see the resemblance between him and the young woman presenting evidence of fraud. Others simply recognized the sound of truth when they heard it, especially when backed up by documentation and recordings. The confrontation that followed was everything Alessandra had imagined and more. Maximilian alternated between denying everything and trying to justify his actions, claiming he had been protecting her from her own immaturity and inexperience. He accused her of being ungrateful for the care he had provided after her parents' death, conveniently ignoring the fact that his care had consisted of defrauding her of millions and abandoning her to poverty. "You were 17 years old and in no condition to manage a business empire," he shouted, finally dropping his facade of concerned uncle and revealing the coldly calculating man beneath. "I saved this company from your inevitable mismanagement. I preserved the Thornfield name and legacy that you would have destroyed through inexperience and emotional decision-making." "By stealing it," Alessandra replied calmly. "By forging documents, bribing officials, and lying to courts. By letting me believe I was poor while you lived in luxury off my parents' work. By making me so desperate that I had to become a servant in my own home just to survive." The legal battle that followed was swift but intense. Alessandra's evidence was overwhelming, and Maximilian's attempts to discredit her fell apart under scrutiny. The forensic accountants who examined the estate's finances found clear proof of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement on a massive scale. Bank officials who had been bribed began confessing in exchange for lighter sentences, and the carefully constructed house of lies that Maximilian had built collapsed completely. Within 3 months, Maximilian Thornfield was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. His assets were seized to pay restitution, though much of the stolen money was never recovered from the offshore accounts where he had hidden it. But the Thornfield mansion, the family business, and what remained of the estate were returned to their rightful owner, a young woman who had learned more about life, hardship, and the true nature of friendship during 6 months as a servant than she had during 17 years as a princess. The transition back to wealth was surprisingly difficult for Alessandra. After months of living on a servant's wages, of scrubbing floors and being invisible, it felt strange to suddenly be wealthy again. She kept her room in the servants' quarters for several weeks after revealing her true identity, not yet ready to return to the luxury suite that had once been hers. The simplicity of her small room, the honest satisfaction of work well done, and the genuine friendships she had formed with the staff had become more meaningful to her than all the material possessions she had once treasured. But more than that, her experience had given her a perspective on wealth and privilege that she never could have gained otherwise. She had seen how easily someone with money and connections could manipulate the system, how vulnerable ordinary people were to those who controlled resources and information. She had also learned that dignity, kindness, and integrity had nothing to do with bank account balances, and that some of the richest people she had ever known were living in servants' quarters while some of the poorest were sitting in boardrooms wearing $1,000 suits. Alessandra's first major decision as the restored heir to the Thornfield fortune was to establish a foundation dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud and providing legal assistance to people who couldn't afford to fight for justice. She had experienced firsthand how easy it was for someone with resources to prey on those without them, and she was determined to level the playing field for future victims. Her second decision was to completely restructure the household staff arrangements. Instead of traditional servants' quarters, she converted part of the mansion into comfortable apartments where staff members could live with dignity and privacy. She also implemented profit-sharing programs and educational assistance funds, ensuring that people like Maria, James, and Sophie could pursue their dreams without sacrificing their security. "Why are you doing all this?" Mrs. Caldwell asked her one morning as they discussed the renovations. "Most wealthy families want to minimize staff expenses, not increase them." Alessandra smiled, thinking of the months when she had been on the other side of the employer-employee relationship. "Because I learned that the people who work hardest are often valued least, and the people who deserve the most respect are frequently treated as invisible. I can't change the whole world, but I can change how things work in my corner of it." The most profound change, however, was in Alessandra herself. The sheltered, naive girl who had trusted her uncle completely and never questioned her own privilege was gone forever. In her place was a young woman who understood that true security came not from inherited wealth but from inner strength, genuine relationships, and the ability to survive any circumstance life might present. She also learned that justice and revenge were not the same thing. While part of her had wanted to see Maximilian suffer as she had suffered, the actual satisfaction came not from his punishment but from preventing him from hurting anyone else. The money he had stolen could be recovered, the damage to her life could be repaired, but the lessons she had learned about resilience, empathy, and the true meaning of worth were priceless. 2 years after revealing her identity, Alessandra stood in the same dining room where she had once served dinner as an invisible servant. But now she was hosting her own dinner party, not for business associates or social climbers, but for the people who had shown her kindness when she had nothing to offer in return. Maria sat at the head table with her family, who had come to visit from El Salvador. James was there with his daughter, the doctor, who had flown in from her residency program in Chicago. Sophie sat beside her new husband, a fellow student she had met while working her way through college. "I want to propose a toast," Alessandra said, raising her glass to the assembled group. "To the family we choose, the strength we discover in ourselves when everything else is taken away, and the understanding that our true worth has nothing to do with what we own and everything to do with who we are when nobody is watching." As glasses clinked and voices rose in celebration, Alessandra reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything and gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that she could survive anything, the friendships that came from shared struggle rather than shared privilege, and the wisdom to understand that sometimes we have to lose ourselves completely before we can discover who we really are. The girl who had once cried over choosing between diamond earrings now understood that the most precious things in life could never be stolen, because they lived not in bank accounts or jewelry boxes but in the strength of the human spirit and the connections we make with others along the way. She had been a rich girl who became poor, a poor girl who became invisible, and an invisible girl who finally learned to see herself clearly. And in that clarity, she found not just her fortune, but her purpose, her peace, and her place in a world that was far more complex and beautiful than she had ever imagined from her ivory tower.